The Admirals vs. Yonko is one of the most highly debated topics within the One Piece verse. But why is that? As far back as the War of the Best, fans have disputed whether or not an Admiral could defeat a Yonko in a one-on-one, and 15 years later, that question is still somewhat up in the air. Before we begin, I want to make it clear that I do not personally care which faction is stronger. But I also want to be as transparent as possible when I say that, overall, I do prefer the characters classified as Yonko over most Marine soldiers. Whichever faction ends up being ultimately stronger doesn't really matter to me, as long as there is sufficient evidence when it comes to supporting a side. So with all that out of the way, let's begin. The first thing I need to establish when discussing such a divisive topic is that we won't likely receive a definitive answer until we get closer to the final war arc. Every single interaction between an Admiral and a Yonko up until now has had some form of nuance that has prevented either faction from appearing entirely above the other in terms of overall power. If you ask me, the result one reaches will boil down to two factors: how one chooses to interpret the major clashes between Admirals and Yonko, and which faction or characters one prefers. I believe that context and narrative are extremely important when discussing something that has no definitive answer. Feats and statements can help pave the way to forming a claim, but without the proper context and narrative to support it, one might find it difficult to make an argument for said claim as comprehensively as possible. This is just a fancy way to say that if you want to convince someone, in this case me, that an Admiral is as strong or stronger than a Yonko, then you'll have to find as many narrative implications and use as much context as possible in order to support your claim. So what does it mean to be a Yonko? It's not just a title that some random pirate obtains because they have a really broken devil fruit or some great aspirations. Each Yonko not only holds a large amount of influence within the New World in terms of the number of islands under their protection, but they also have several weaker crews under their command, which form their personal fleets. Becoming an Emperor of the Sea not only makes you one of the four most powerful pirates in the world, but it creates a specific dynamic between these individuals and the world government, ultimately creating the three great powers. The world government, the Yonko, and the seven warlords essentially constitute these three great powers in order to bring balance. However, the seven warlord system was originally created and intended to work on behalf of the Marines in order to help them maintain said balance. That is because the Yonko potentially have equal, if not greater, overall firepower than the Marines. Just to be clear, when I say Marines, I mean just the Navy. The world government could be considered its own separate faction with its own resources and sub-factions like the Gods Knights and CP0, which is also why Oda has made the distinction of giving both of these factions separate flags. In addition, cross-guilds set bounties on the Marines, and the Revolutionary Army only attacks celestial dragons, but that's a separate discussion in and of itself. The Marines are in fact the world government's personal police force, and if you remove the distinction of pirate and marine, they are also the largest crew in the world in terms of raw numbers, with bases established all over the Grand Line and Four Blues. When looking at the balance of power, it becomes evident that the Marines enlisting the help of pirates to the point they are willing to pardon any prior or future actions in order to counteract and even possibly defeat the force of a Yonko creates a very big implication that the Yonko may hold a military might that surpasses what their elite soldiers are capable of on their own. As a reminder, it's not the Marines versus all four Emperors of the Sea. It's the Marines versus the Yonko versus each other. This is why Kaido and Big Mom joining forces would cause the formation of the strongest pirate crew in history, with a collective bounty even greater than Gold D. Roger himself. Between having to gather 7 of the most notorious pirates in the modern day in order to fight off Whitebeard's fleet, and not having enough manpower to send to Wano in order to stop Kaido and Big Mom's alliance, it becomes at least evident that the Emperors hold a power that the Marines do not want to take head on. Now that we've established at least a narrative implication between the power of a Yonko crew and the Marines, how does this relate to the Admirals versus the Yonko? Well, I want to talk about the 4 major clashes, beginning with Whitebeard and Marineford. During the War of the Best, we see multiple encounters between Whitebeard and each of the Admirals after Whitebeard was stabbed in the chest by one of his men. Before their individual encounters, I want to point out that one of his shockwaves was stopped by all 3 Admirals, who used the emission application of advanced armament Haki. He clashes once with Aokiji, and both characters fail to do any meaningful damage to one another. He intercepts Kizaru while he was targeting Luffy, and Kizaru later stops his Naginata and lands 2 light beams straight through his chest. His most notable clashes were actually against Akainu, who stalemated one of his earthquakes, and both showed the capacity to counter each other's attacks. I think it's important to point out how relative all of these encounters are, because in many ways, none of these characters really imply that they are going all out. Whitebeard only went to Marineford to save Ace, and it's constantly shown that his earthquakes could destroy the island itself if he's not careful. The Admirals, on the other hand, never really show anything past basic applications of their devil fruits. I've seen people argue that they also can't go all out for the same reasons as Whitebeard, but as far as I'm aware, it's never implied through any text. More so, we know this because we've seen them fight post-time skip. Regardless, by the time that Whitebeard and Akainu have both of their fights, each character catches the other in an off-guard state. Whitebeard did not go to Marineford in any shape that would be even remotely close to his prime. He is old and has a terminal illness that even affected him on the battlefield. This gave Akainu the perfect chance to put a hole in his chest that was likely filled with magma. In addition to both of these wounds, Whitebeard was also blasted and stabbed by several captains and vice admirals. By the time Akainu killed Ace, he still hadn't taken any damage throughout the entirety of the war. Whitebeard hits him from behind once, causing massive damage, and even though Akainu took out part of Whitebeard's face, he hit him so hard that he nearly destroyed Marine HQ and created a crevice that removed Akainu from the battlefield for 2 chapters. I'll give you my thoughts on each of these encounters after I've covered all of them, so with this one out of the way, let's move on to Blackbeard versus Kuzan. One of the biggest points of discussion when talking about this exchange that I've seen people bring up is that Blackbeard did not want to fight Kuzan under any circumstances, which has led many people to believe that an Admiral should be stronger than a Yonko. I obviously don't agree with this for a couple of reasons, the most important of which is that Kuzan had frozen Blackbeard's crew members before they even started talking. He even states that if he uses his Tremor fruit, which is his main source of offensive power, his crew would crumble into pieces. I will add that when Kuzan overheard Laffitte's plan to take his fruit, he immediately threatened a fight, and Blackbeard did his best to defuse the situation since he had no intention in taking Kuzan's fruit. Moving on, the third clash was probably the shortest, with Greenbull entering the borders of Wano in order to take Luffy's head. While fighting the Akazaya 9, Momonosuke, and Yamato, he makes a very interesting remark about how Kaido was the biggest deterrent for anyone who attempted to invade Wano, which should include the Marines. Right afterwards, Shanks releases a blast of Haki that is so powerful, he immediately forces Greenbull to revert back to his human form through sheer intimidation. It's not much of an encounter versus an actual Yonko, but it does say a lot about the fear that a Marine soldier can have when being faced with the possibility of having to fight a Yonko. Finally, the most divisive of all these clashes comes from Luffy versus Kizaru. This fight specifically gave a lot of context for what an admiral can do when fighting with some level of agency. The first thing we need to break down is that Luffy started off the fight with Gear 4 Snake Man, which is commonly considered his speed form, for obvious reasons. Kizaru could block and parry Luffy's Black Mamba, and he could even accelerate his body to the point he could blitz Luffy while he was likely using Future Sight. I want to point out how important it is that we first talk about this exchange, because in reality it conveys just how massive of an amp Gear 5 is in regards to Luffy's other gears. As soon as Luffy transforms and returns to the lab, he's capable of grabbing Kizaru, who at least seems to be aware that something is approaching. He throws Kizaru so far that the very clouds are scattered due to the force he used. Kizaru returns to Egghead by reflecting his light off the surface of the ocean and splits himself into multiple light clones. Given the context of both the anime and manga, Kizaru only lands a single hit against Gear 5 Luffy, which is this scratch right here. The clones chase Luffy, he outruns them and takes them out in a single kick. Kizaru tricks Luffy in order to finish his mission. He then sees Vegapunk escape and attempts to shoot him down with a single beam, which Luffy ate. He continues to chase after Vegapunk, and when Luffy catches up to him, Kizaru tries to shoot Luffy, who dodged the beam and puts him down in a single hit. This whole clash doesn't technically end here because we get a pseudo round 2, but that falls under manga spoilers, so if you want to avoid it, please pause and skip to this timestamp. After Luffy refuels, Kizaru continues his mission of eliminating Vegapunk and anyone targeted by the Gorosei. He tries to cut down Bonnie and Kuma in one fell swoop, but is immediately tagged by Luffy, who is lying on his back, laughing after transforming. Kizaru kills Vegapunk after he was already stabbed by Saturn. Luffy dodges Saturn's attacks, and as Kizaru gives chase to Sanji, who took Vegapunk with him, Luffy grabs both him and Saturn at the same time and holds them off. He then dodges their combined assault and flattens them into pizza dough and tosses them away. Kizaru landed on a ship and stopped fighting from that point onward. Saturn turned around and continued to attack Luffy. So now that I've broken down each of these 4 interactions, what conclusion can we draw from them? I did my best to explain each encounter as objectively as possible given the context of each scene and the author's possible intent. In reality, there's not much to talk about with Kuzan's encounter with Blackbeard, since the circumstances at the time prevented Blackbeard from using one of his devil fruits, and Greenbull was warded off by Shanks' presence. We really only need to talk about Whitebeard versus the Admirals and Luffy versus Kizaru because they're the only 2 clashes where a Yonko is literally fighting an Admiral. I'm going to rip off the band-aid with this one and just give you guys my honest opinion. As always, I would like to ask you guys to at least hear me out and my thought process before you go typing in the comments. I really do think I have an extremely fair take when it comes to this or any other specific topic of this variety. So with that being said, as far as all of the information that we currently have regarding these 2 factions, there is absolutely no way I could even remotely consider any Admiral beating a Yonko in a 1v1. Okay, let's talk about Whitebeard versus Marineford. For starters, we should consider that Whitebeard is in the worst state he could possibly be in and had suffered damage before he even joined the battlefield. He had a hole in his chest, he was stabbed and shot multiple times, and he still removed one of the Admirals from the battlefield after getting angry. In my personal opinion, if I had to choose which one of these 2 characters won, I'll always go with the guy who removed his opponent from the battlefield. I don't think anyone can deny that Whitebeard was both extremely sick and also way past his prime by the time of Marineford. In fact, I believe he's honestly the weakest of the Yonko for a good number of reasons, but the biggest one is his inability to use Advanced Conqueror's Haki. ACOC is a massive amp, and it's also what separates the Yonko from the Admirals. Whitebeard went into each one of his fights having taken more damage than any of the Admirals, especially Akainu. He was still able to keep up with and combat Kizaru and Aokiji, although granted, given what we know about their real capabilities, they didn't really go all out. His real matchup was against Akainu, who is generally considered by most of the fanbase as one of, if not the strongest of the Admirals, although he's realistically not that much stronger than at least Kuzan. Their battle in Punk Hazard took about 10 days and it was extremely close. Kuzan lost a leg and Sakazuki was scarred all over. It's been assumed by a good number of fans that both of these characters have gotten considerably stronger if the concept of Haki Bloom or Doriki is applied to such a close fight. However, there is no way to quantify how much stronger they've gotten, and it's kind of impossible to tell if they've gotten any stronger since that fight, especially since the only other context we have is their battles in Marineford. Kuzan is the only one of the 2 that's actively moving around in the world and has gotten into more fights in the last 2 years than Akainu, who's only really received a promotion that keeps him at a desk. It's not even stated anywhere or implied that either of these 2 have gotten stronger throughout any line of text. One of the biggest points that I always see people bring up is that Whitebeard caught Akainu off guard with a sucker punch, but they always fail to bring up the fact that his heart caused him trouble during their first encounter, and Akainu also got a free shot. If you ask me, both of these situations sort of cancel each other out because Oda has made it clear in both Luffy vs. Crocodile and Luffy vs. Katakuri that a fight involving pirates has no rules. The simple objective truth here is that when Akainu put a hole in Whitebeard's chest, he was also attacked by a bunch of marine soldiers, so he suffered even more damage than just a simple magma punch to the chest. Akainu had suffered no damage up until Whitebeard attacked him from behind. He was capable of taking the first hit and even took out a part of Whitebeard's face, but that's the last time he ever landed a hit, and Whitebeard retaliated with a hit so powerful that he spit out blood and was removed from the battlefield for 2 chapters. An old sick man past his prime with a hole in his chest and half of his face missing grabbed Akainu and put him down in 2 hits. I've tried to look at this as many ways as possible, but the simple fact is Whitebeard temporarily removed Akainu from the battlefield while he was in an objectively worse condition. If you ask me, Whitebeard legitimately won that exchange, and there really isn't another way of looking at it. He took more damage, he had parts of his body missing, and yet he was still the only one standing after that exchange. Akainu may not have been knocked out, but he clearly didn't win either. Luffy versus Kizaru, on the other hand, is just one massive headache in my opinion. Let's make a few things clear. One of the biggest arguments that I usually hear in regards to Kizaru is that he was mentally nerfed the entire time he was on Egghead, which according to some had a massive impact on his performance. For context, Kizaru was tasked with killing Vegapunk because of his research regarding the Void Century. Because of their past friendship, Borsalino narratively did not want to kill Vegapunk. However, that does not mean that he wasn't going to go out of his way to do it. As a matter of fact, when rereading through Egghead, it becomes blatantly obvious, at least to me, that he was doing his best to simply get the job done and get out of Egghead as quickly and efficiently as possible. Luffy being a newly crowned Yonko and also occupying the island would obviously cause this to become a more arduous task than he would have wanted. In fact, you can see this being evident when he says that he's just trying to complete his mission and Luffy is making it difficult for him. One thing that I never hear from people who defend the Admiral agenda is the assumption that Kizaru may have actually been trying to defeat Luffy. The anime definitely made this a lot more apparent, at least to me, simply because we've never seen Kizaru pull out half of the things that he used against Luffy. Some people might disagree with me on this, but I genuinely do think Kizaru was going all out, or at least he was trying to put down Luffy. Think about it for just a second. If he defeats Luffy, there is no one else on the island that can stop him from killing Vegapunk. It's genuinely a win-win for him, and for those that might say, but he didn't want to kill Vegapunk, he still accomplishes that task towards the end of the arc after he was already stabbed by Saturn. Well, what about all the sandbagging, or the fact that he was implied by Oda to be the one who gave Luffy food? Well, think about it from this perspective. He already had the resolve to see the mission through. Luffy was a foil to said mission, and since Kizaru got first-hand experience when it came to fighting him, he must have realized that Luffy should be capable enough to get Vegapunk out of Egghead. So if he realized that Luffy could get him out, then why did he still kill Vegapunk? Because his boss was literally standing there. Listen, I could really sit here and try to break down every gripe someone might have with the decisions that Oda made these characters take, but honestly, this video would be a lot longer than it already is. This entire conversation really just boils down to the following. In every single encounter where an Admiral fights a Yonko, there is always a reason or excuse as to why the Admiral loses. Akainu was caught off guard, Kizaru was mentally nerfed. My question here is, if the Admirals couldn't go all out because of a certain circumstance, why would that automatically mean that they could beat a Yonko in a 1v1 if it weren't for that case? Both of these concepts are kind of exclusive without a piece of evidence that directly links them. I am perfectly fine with the idea of an admiral having the capacity to defeat a Yonko in a one-on-one fight, but there isn't a single piece of evidence within the entire story of One Piece that even remotely implies that a singular admiral could put themselves in an advantageous position against a Yonko without any story-related shenanigans. Even when looking at the One Piece film Red scene, where Kizaru and Shanks have a small exchange, the Yonko is consistently shown to always have an advantage over the Admiral. In all three exchanges where they actually do fight, the Yonko is always portrayed as the winner of the encounter. Whitebeard removed Akainu from the battlefield for 2 chapters with only 2 hits. Luffy put down Kizaru 2 separate times while only landing 1 hit each time. There really isn't any misinterpretation here, I'm just telling you what is happening on the page. Kizaru could be holding back, sure, but that doesn't mean that he would beat Luffy if he wasn't, and there really isn't any evidence to support that it would have been the case. Not to mention, Luffy was also fighting Saturn at the same time, who isn't holding back, has immortality hacks, and is likely at the very least as strong as Kizaru. Luffy is out here taking on 2 Admiral level threats at the same time, and yet I'm supposed to believe that Kizaru is holding back so much that if he weren't mentally nerfed, he would be a bigger problem than both his current self and an immortal poison-covered giant Ushioni. As a reminder, he landed a single hit against Luffy and it was a scratch on his face. And if I'm going by the anime, he slept on Kizaru. All I'm saying is, Luffy never slept on Kaido. What about current Fleet Admiral Akainu? I'm sure many would say that he can definitely defeat a Yonko in a one-on-one, but this opinion is genuinely unsubstantiated, at least as of chapter 1149. He has done nothing in the last 2 years and has been stuck on a desk without any feats besides tagging Bartholomew Kuma, who isn't even a Yonko level fighter. I know some people would bring up his bounty is almost as high as Roger, but if you look at the context of how Crossgill has made their Marine Wanted posters, he's worth 5 billion berries not because he's powerful, but because he's the Fleet Admiral. It's based entirely on position, and if we're supposed to look at these wanted posters like the Marines Wanted posters, they're not even indicative of a character's power level, more so how much of a threat they are to the world government. Finally, let's bring up their potential Devil Fruit awakenings. There's nothing concrete to talk about. None of the Admirals have any statements that even remotely imply they have awakened their Devil Fruits. In fact, the only piece of evidence that some have used to assume such a thing could be the case is the current state of Punk Hazard. The 10-day-long match between Akainu and Aokiji resulted in the weather of Punk Hazard being permanently altered so that half of it is covered in lava and volcanoes, and the other half is frozen solid with giant mountains. I definitely understand the assumption that some people may have in regards to this being a potential call to their awakenings, but there's nothing that confirms this was a result of 2 awakened Logias clashing. I'm not saying it can't be possible, or that it wasn't the case, only that there is no evidence to directly confirm it. Even then, this would only confirm that Kuzan and Sakazuki have awakened their Devil Fruits, but this wouldn't apply to Borsalino. I don't have much else to talk about in regards to this topic. If you ask me, all 3 Admirals are necessary in order to take down a Yonko. I don't think that any combination of 2 Admirals or any single Admiral can beat any Yonko in a fight not named Buggy the Clown. I don't see how any of them even remotely hurt someone like Kaido without internal destruction or ACOC, which none of them are stated or implied to know. Big Mom might be a big back, but she was keeping up with Kaido and could fight him for 3 days straight without a single scratch on her, so regardless of whether or not you think she's weaker than Kaido is kind of irrelevant, because in reality she is portrayed narratively to be his equal, and she was never knocked out in Onigashima. She was removed from the battlefield. Shanks scared off an Admiral with only his Conqueror's Haki, and if we go by Film Red, he even blitzed Kizaru. Luffy fought 2 Admiral level threats at the same time and he beat Kaido in a one-on-one. None of this is to say that I think the difference between a Yonko and an Admiral is so large that they can't do anything. I think both factions are a lot closer than people are willing to consider. And I also believe that an Admiral can give a Yonko a very good fight, but I just cannot see them coming out ahead in a fight because there is no evidence to suggest that would really be the case. Anyways, that's all for the video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. If you'd like to join my Discord, you can support my Ko-Fi for 1 month for only $2 to gain permanent access, or you can become a YouTube member. I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.